Da-da, da-na-na-na-na-na. Ha-da! Hi, everybody. At this point, you have worked very hard to make some beautiful models of increasing complexity. And now it's time to take those models and make them look as 3D as humanly possible. So we are going to talk today about lights, materials, and renders. Hence the reason why this is called Introduction to Lighting and Rendering. So let's get started. Now, if you want to follow along with me, there's two very important things to consider. Number one, if you'd like to, with me, you can build a very simple plane and three tall cubes, just like I have here, to do some lighting examples for yourself. I'm going to be using this window, which is what we call the render view, to show you a real-time example of what these lights do. This will be up in the top right-hand corner of the screen. I promise to explain what this render view does at the end of the video. I just want to have some nice examples for you to show. Additionally, if you are working from home, please pay attention to a couple things. Number one, this video tutorial is using Maya 2016. Most of the stuff I'm going to say transfers over to 2017, no problem. However, 2017 uses that Arnold renderer that I've talked about in the past, and I want to have a separate video just to talk about how to use it and the differences in the future. I figured for now, I'll show you some basic rendering types and consider this an introduction to 3D lighting because of that. So, if you want Maya's Mental Ray plugin, I have it on the blog in a link probably below your notes for actual lighting techniques and stuff. Because of this, you can actually click on this link and go down to the bottom where it says Mental Ray plugin for Maya 2016 right here, and click on the one that works for you. If you have a Macintosh computer, an Apple computer, if you have a Windows PC, or if you have a Linux PC, you're able to click the link, download it to your computer, open it up, follow the simple instructions. It's basically going to say, I'm going to save this file here. Do you want to do that? Hit yes, and you'll be able to access Mental Ray. All right, so introduction over. Let's talk about renders and how they actually work. So, like I said before, this top corner is going to serve as a real-time example of everything that you're going to see. And if you notice at the very top, this is what we've basically been working on in the past, which is default lighting. This is what we can see when we first turn on Maya, but this won't give us the lighting we need for our films. If I hit the 7 key, which is the turn on lights key, you notice everything turns up black because we don't have any lights. So let's create some lights, and I will tell you what they do, and then we'll talk about how to use them. So all of the lights that you want can be found under Create, Lights, and they're right here. We got ambience, directional lights, point lights, spotlights, area lights, and volume lights. We also have some additional ones in Mental Ray: object lights, physical area lights, suns, environment skies, and environment images. We won't really talk about these just yet. I'll mention the physical sun one at the end because that's what I actually use to make the render before. It's good for like test renders and things like that. However, I want to go ahead and work with some basics. So let's create a directional light first. Now, a directional light actually functions very similarly to the sun. If you look at our render up here, right now, the only thing that you can see is one side of these pillars. And that is because if I zoom in to these pillars and I click on the light that I have here, if you notice, this directional light has some arrows on it. Now, the arrows actually indicate the shape of the handles for the light, and they also indicate what the light is doing. They don't necessarily change just by moving them up and down or scaling them up and down where the light is going to be. Directional lights are very specific with this. Because it functions like the sun, if I change where that arrow is pointing, it'll basically cake my entire scene in the same angle of light, just like the sun that's up. So As an example, this is kind of like twilight, if you will, sunset, sunrise. Let's tilt it down, and if you notice, the scene lights up a little bit. And in our render, you can actually see some shadows appear in the top right hand corner. And that's because those shadows are being cast by these objects. Now, directional lights, like I said, function like the sun. Um, I will mention very soon what all of this means. This is inside of our attribute editor. But for right now, directional lights function like the sun. I'm going to delete that one. Next light that we need to talk about is the point light. Sorry, not the point light, but the spotlight. Spotlight is very useful. It kind of functions similarly to what you understand if you've ever seen a flashlight or spotlights for actual film, traditional spotlights. They have on them, and I'll actually move this up and pull this out. As you can see, the spotlight has a cone of influence around it, an arrow that shows the direction the light is pointing, as well as a little point that all the light comes from, which is infinite in space. This is different from a light in real life because we know the source of the light that we make comes from either the filaments inside the light bulb, we can say it's the light bulb itself. This comes from an infinite point, so you're able to project it infinitely if you so choose. If you notice, it basically creates a light in the shape of your spotlight. You can angle the light wherever you want, and it'll basically put light on your object but not affect the other things around it. This is a stage light. This is what is used often in like live theater plays if we need to focus on one character but we don't need to focus on the others. It helps you basically filter light a certain direction but only light specific things. All right, I'm going to delete that one. So the next one that becomes important for us to think about is an ambient light. So I'm going to go to lights, create ambient light. So an ambient light, and I'll actually point to this and color it just so you can see it. An ambient light is kind of like a point light, which I haven't necessarily shown you yet. What it basically does is it creates ambience. It creates a soft light that paints the entire scene in a specific blend of color. Let's say you're underwater, right? And you want everything to have that nice general shade of blue to it. You can change the color of this light, and it'll basically cake the entire scene in just a little bit of blue. Oops, sorry, I accidentally undid the light that I just made. Let me do that. All right, and we should be good. Yeah, there we go. And so it cakes the whole scene in blue. And if you notice, the light source, this little tiny dot right here, will change where the light's most important is. Um, it also will, if I scale up and down, won't affect the actual function of the light itself. So if you want this light in many ways to have a light source and kind of create some basic like light and shadow and basically start caking your scene a certain way, this is a good light for that. Builds a very soft light, puts it places. You can generate shadows. I know by default you see it doesn't generate shadows on the ground or anything. You can play with those and actually build shadows. But yeah, that's what an ambient light does. I'm going to close that. And now something that functions similarly to an ambient light, but is a much more intense version of it in many cases, the point light. So the point light, if I pull this up, not only projects light across the scene, it operates similarly to a candle. A candle, in the sense that it is a very tiny miniature star and it comes from a single point. And as you move this light through space, the light becomes softer. If you notice where the light shows up most, it's brightest. And as it projects out, it becomes a little darker and a little darker. And if you notice, it also projects very stark shadows as well. A point light is very intense. It's a light in the middle of space, and it functions as such. Big difference between an ambient light and a point light is that an ambient light is there if you want to give a scene kind of its own color, its own glow. It'll be very soft. A point light is more for if you need that light you create to be the main source of light or one of the main sources of light in your scene. Much like how a candle functions in the dark. Everybody crowds around a candle, that candle shows where everything is. That's how a point light functions. Now, next one that's very useful is an area light. Now, an area light is interesting because as a light, when it's created, it creates a box. And I'm actually going to pull this up real quick and I'll zoom in so you can see that box didn't necessarily generate a very intense light, but we have some shadows. We have a degradation of the light as it travels in distance. So it gets a little bit darker as it moves further on in distance. But we also see a very hard edge down here. And that hard edge is actually created by this flat shape here. An area light emits light in a specific direction. If you notice, when I look the opposite direction, my render turns black. But if I look this way, you can see that the light that's created and the light that is projected only comes from a set direction, and it only comes out a certain amount. I can turn it down here. If you notice, it's going to beam more towards the ground and actually be a little bit more intense. But this box with the indicator actually can also, if you so choose, represent the shape of the light as well. It's just a light for projecting light in a single direction at a continuous rate, projecting shadows and everything, but covering a wide range of space. Everything to the left and to the right of this area light will be caked out in this light to a certain degree, but everything behind it will not. This is a light for when you want to separate focus, project more light onto a single object. Now, the volume light is very interesting. If I go to the lights and click the volume light actually does not function similarly to other lights. If I pull this light up, you notice in my preview for my scene, we see the light. But here in the render view, we do not see it. That is because the volume light is actually designed to function within a set closed space. Do you see those rings around that center point there? These rings right here? These rings show where the light is going to extend to and where it's going to stop. Light will not escape out of that ring. However, if I put something in this ring, I'm going to scale this up so now these objects are kind of in there a little bit. You notice in our render, we actually get a little bit of light in there. This is really useful when you only want to create light in a certain area, when you want to create light in a certain spot, and you don't want that light to escape out of that spot. If I move this volume light and I put it in just like this in the center, and I zoom into this object, just like so, I kind of position it so it sits on that corner so we can see both parts of that object at the same time, it'll probably be a little bit easier for you to see that it's only lighting that piece of an object. This is really good for horror movies and things like that when you only want to show like that one small thing that shows up and then disappears. It's the same thing as if we have a light source but we built a mask around it so it only escapes out of a certain area. This light is one of the lights that shows the benefit of working in 3D. Sometimes you can do some crazy things that are much harder to achieve based on physical real life objects alone. And those are the basic lights that you have in your scene. Now, these lights are operated and controlled with our attribute editor, which, as a reminder, is this little button up here, or you can hit Control A couple times to bring it up. It also shows up down here if it's already been up once. This is on the right side of the screen. Now, to show you what the attribute editor does, I am going to make sure I create a spotlight. I think a spotlight usually serves as a really good example for this attribute editor. So I'm going to move my render view to the top left-hand corner and open it, and I will zoom into the screen just a bit so you can better see what's going on. So every light has a few common settings. And I want to show you what those common settings are. The attribute editor is basically what it says. It changes the attributes of whatever you're making. It changes not only the look and feel of it, but also the way it functions. The channel box basically is the history of the object. The attribute editor is what it is currently doing, what it wants to be right now, today. So most lights have a few basic shapes, and I'll go ahead and show you what they are right here. Color and intensity usually is across the bat. Color, what color do you want the light to be? I can make it any color in the world if I want. Let's do something kind of warm at the moment. Let's make it yellow. Cool. Intensity is how intense that light is. Higher the intensity, brighter the light actually gets. Lower the intensity, the softer the light gets as well. Decay rate is very interesting. Now, decay actually is the difference between making something that doesn't look realistic and making something that does look realistic. Light, if you take a flashlight that you get from like from any store, and you have batteries in it and the batteries fade over time, when you shoot that light out, the further that light travels, the softer it gets. You can adjust how that functions in here with decay rate. Now, if you click linear, right now it's set to no decay, so it's basically just showing up as is. If you click linear, you'll notice that the drop off of that light increases. Quadratic increases even more. And that is because what's happening is that Maya is actually calculating where that light is and how it drops off in space. If you remember quadratic equations, and I promise not to get too much into this right now because I know this is just an intro, there are multiple calculations that are made to figure out the result of whatever it is you're creating. Linear is a little simpler. These two function together to build realistic lighting. So if you're ever working with a linear or a quadratic amount of decay, the best and simplest way to think about it is that linear and quadratic require higher numbers of intensity to function. And that is because they are working off of real world rules and they're taking air into consideration. And I do mean air as in the air you breathe. Light travels through air particles. It bounces off of certain things so we can actually see objects. The further we travel, the more that light expands through air, the more that light decays to our eyes, but that light continues traveling on forever. So we turn that up to change that. Now, if we're dealing with cone angle, I'm going to set this back to decay so we can actually mess around with this a little bit. Cone angle, in this particular example, changes how wide that spotlight gets. Wider spotlight means more light caked out for us to see. Less light, more light. Less light, more light. Now, penumbra. Penumbra, not to be confused with the video game called Penumbra, is refers to the outer edge of the light that you create. So in this particular case, it's referring to that negative space outside of the light itself. You have the light and then you have that outer edge of the light itself. If you change that penumbra angle, it actually softens and opens up that penumbra and lets more light in. If you lower it, it actually pushes and compresses the light. Drop off does the same thing, but it affects the light itself. It affects how much that light drops off, how soft that light becomes. Higher drop off means that light is being filtered more as it travels. Consider these settings to change the strength of the battery in your light. I think that's usually a good way of thinking about it. Now, we do have light effects. We can make lights glow. We can add fog and do other things. We can also play with the shadow, and the shadow, I think, is actually a fairly important effect. And I'm going to turn this up just so you can see it, maybe zoom in the screen. If you look at the top left-hand corner of the screen, if I turn down the shadow color, the lights actually become brighter or softer. And the reason being for this, I'll go ahead and turn the shadow color off of yellow and set it back to, the light color off of yellow, set it back to white. What the shadow color does is soften the actual shadows you see. Soften not only how you see them, but where they actually show up as well. Um, Playing with this basically makes it so you can have easier shadows that look a little bit softer, look a little bit more realistic. Everything we do is about making objects look more realistic. Now, there's a bunch of other settings that we can have. Things for mental ray, as well as things for what we call depth map shadow attributes. I won't get into this too much right now because this is something you will actually learn through experimentation. But depth map shadows take the distance from the camera into consideration for showing us a high quality shadow. Things that are further away, we don't need to see as much. Things that are closer can be more detailed. So we can adjust the resolution of the shadows themselves. Mental ray shadows actually function more off of mathematic calculation for us to see where things are. And there's usually a lot of settings that we can use, not just for the shadow, but also the way the shadow bounces off the object, which is incredibly important. Now, speaking of the way shadows bounce off objects, one thing that I just want to let everybody know, the attributes change depending on the objects you use. I'm only going to pull this up as an example, but if I get an area light as an example, and I pull this area light back up so I can get some nice little shadows on the scene, and I go down to my shadow color, I can lighten up my shadows just like I did before, and it'll actually change how soft the shadows become. I can increase the intensity or decrease it as well. Um, but if I go in here, there's some shadow attributes for ray tracing, which will show up when you're using mental ray. These actually will adjust the quality of the shadows, and they will also adjust where those shadows show up and where they occur. They change the quality, they change the drop off of it. You're able to play with these settings. I set depth limit there. You're able to adjust like the angle, adjust how much we actually see of these shadows, and adjust the overall quality of them as well, if you notice. Higher number usually is going to increase the quality if we're talking about the depth limit. Um, and shadow rays, as well as like light angle and some other things, will actually help us adjust the actual quality of the shadows themselves. Okay, so um, besides that, we need to talk about a couple other things. One of the things that's really important to think about when we're dealing with lights is how they bounce off objects. And they bounce off objects using the materials we make and the renderers we make. Now, to do this, we're going to get into coloring our objects. So I'm going to color these basic objects we have here by right-clicking the object and going to Assign New Material, which is right down here. Let me zoom in a little bit so you can see it a bit better. Right-click, go down, Assign New Material. You're going to get a window that pops up. There's a bunch of different ways to do this, but in this window, we're going to be focusing on two basic ones right now, the Lambert and the blend. This is what we call a shader. It's the skin of your object. It shows what that object looks like, and it shows how light bounces off that object as well. We need this so we can make a good 3D image. So, Lamberts, think of them like matted paper. Blends, think of them like shiny objects. A blend has more settings that we can adjust as a Lambert. It's possible to make a blend function like a Lambert. It is not possible to make a Lambert function like a blend. So, I'm going to grab my Lambert first. So I'm going to click that. And you're going to have a little object pop up in your attribute editor called Lambert 2. This is the skin of our object. I'm just going to make this object blue for right now, just like so. And I'm going to leave it as such. This one I'll keep as the normal one, and then this one I'll have it function as a blend. So I'm going to assign new material. I'm going to go to a blend, and I am going to make this red, dark red, so we can see the shine on it. Okay, so this object is going to remain normal. This is going to be our blend. This is going to be our Lambert. Just so these show up a little bit better, I'm going to thicken them up just so you can see a little bit more of how they function. And if I go in here and I grab another light, I'm going to go ahead and grab a point light as an example. I'm going to pull this up. You can actually even look right now and see that the blend has a much more reflective surface than the Lambert by default. And that's because the Lambert's matted, the blend's reflective. If I click on this blend object, now that it is, I can change the name of the shader. As good practice, it's always a good idea to change the names of your shaders and the skin of your object so you know what it is. So I'm just going to call this red pillar underscore BLN. So I know it's a blend object. And if I look at this, I have settings for color, transparency, ambient color, incandescence, diffuse, translucence, eccentricity, roll off, reflectivity, all kinds of stuff. If I go over here to this Lambert, I have these settings too, but one of the important things to think about between these two objects is that if I look, I don't have a reflectivity setting. It doesn't really show up. And that's because it's not really meant to be super reflective. If I go to this blend object, I get reflectivity as well as eccentricity. Eccentricity refers to the brightness of the highlights, how reflective that object becomes. Does it become like glass or is it more simple? There's a lot of different things that you can do with these objects to play with the settings and make them look as is. I will on the blog have a little list of items that will explain what a lot of these settings mean so you can know what settings you're adjusting, particularly if you ever deal with specular shading, which I think is really important. Now, there are more complex types of objects that you can make. However, for this video, I think the most important thing for you to understand is that the object that you build and the objects that you make have many different types of skin that can go on the object itself. You can create a bunch of different types. There's some down here for reflective materials, ways that you can build things that look like rubber and other objects, and we can use this as a way of setting up our objects to be textured in the future. So what we're building with light is a three-dimensional object that is caked in light, set with specific shadows, so that we can take textures that we put on top of the skin that we currently have. So a single object is affected by lighting that it feels realistic, it has a surface that it feels realistic, and it has a 3D silhouette, outer shape, that looks realistic as well, or at the very least believable. These three things, light, materials, and renders, or sorry, light, materials, and the object itself work together to make a believable image. Now, that we've talked about that, there's one more very important thing to think about, and that is the render itself. Now, I told you that what you have up here is an example of what I was rendering down here. What we call this is an IPR render, which is right up here, this little IPR setting that you see. It's a way to basically preview your image in real time if you're making slight adjustments and be able to compare them without hitting the render button and checking stuff. I'm going to double back now to explain what rendering is just to make life a little bit easier for you, but to help you understand what we're doing. So for the sake of this, I'm going to go ahead and switch back to Maya software. Rendering is the way that we take whatever we model in this three-dimensional space and we build a 2D image off of it. Videos are nothing more than a bunch of two-dimensional images that are made to play one after the other to make what looks like a three-dimensional image. So once we build something that we really like, we hit this render button up here, and it builds a render based on what we have. This is a single image built here. We could go to File and Save Image, and then we have a file that we're happy with, that looks good, that we think is pretty interesting. But we're also able to adjust the type of render we have. Now, the defaults that you usually have when you open Maya are Maya Software, Maya Hardware, Maya Hardware 2.0, and Maya Vector. Mental Ray is something a little bit extra that's actually really awesome and a much more realistic take on rendering. If I click Maya Software, this is basically just using software calculations to make a simple image. If you notice, there are no shadows. Let's go ahead and put some shadows in the scene, just so you can get a better example of what these do. So I'm going to make this directional light, point this down, re-render this image, just like so. No shadows. They don't show up. I can increase the quality of this image. I can increase the way that it renders. But there are other ways to render objects as well. Maya Hardware uses the core hardware inside of your computer to push the render further, render more of it, render it stronger, if you will. I'm trying to come up with the best way to describe this to people who have never necessarily rendered anything before. And one of the ways that I usually associate software and hardware differently is that my software basically works on the power of the program itself to do the calculations. Hardware can function off of like a graphics card that you have in your scene or something like that. I mean, in your computer to make things look a little bit better. My Hardware 2.0 is something that was built in the last few years. It's just to make a more accurate version of your render. There's actually some really cool things you can do with it. Maya Vector takes whatever 3D object you make and it creates a vectorized silhouette of that object, which can be really useful for a number of situations. If you're building characters or you're building a scene, you can basically build something in 3 dimensions, render it under Maya Vector, and it'll take that 3 dimensional object that you've created, turn it into a very flat, graphic 2D image that you can export out and do whatever you want with. Mental Ray is a third party program that was used to make more realistic lighting choices in Maya. And so, for a very long time, it became something that was a part of Maya's history. Um, Most recently in 2016 and 2017. 2016, they had it as an alternative option. And then in 2017, um, they now have something called Arnold. And I think part of that is because Arnold is something that's proprietary with Maya that Maya wants to use and prefers to use. And so just like with tech other tech products, they're pushing it as like a new useful tool to use, and it is very useful. It makes rendering a lot faster in some cases, but it is different and it is something new that people have to learn. Uh, Mental Ray does what I've been doing all this time, which is basically making a much more accurate and realistic representation of whatever you have going on in your scene. I think one of the important things to consider with what I have going on right now is that you can see there's multiple shadows because I have two lights in my scene. And it's actually taking both of those into consideration. It's taking also the reflectivity of this red object that I made. It's bouncing light off of the gray ground here, and it's making the object appear a little bit lighter and a little bit brighter as well. Mental Ray is very useful, and you're going to get to know it very well. Those are your 4 different types of renderer choices. A lot of times, what I recommend for people is that if you're doing a preview, you should hit either um, this render button up here, which will actually preview a selection of your image. You can click that and hit the render button, and it'll only render that portion of your image. Or you can click IPR render, and you can select a portion of your image, and it'll give you real-time updates to how you change your scene. That's what I was using to basically show you how objects change over time, just like that. Now, um, with these particular settings, it's important to remember that this right here is your render button. This is just straight up render a scene. I want to see what the final version looks like. Show it to me in a single image. If you notice, it gives you a render time at the bottom. And right now it only took 4 seconds. As you make more complex objects, that render time is going to increase and increase and increase. And so these two tools up here, this drag a box and preview only that part of the render, and drag a box and IPR render the scene, becomes incredibly useful just for making sure that whatever you generate can be seen quickly and you can work fast as well. The one thing about mental ray is that it does a lot of calculations, so it can be, it's not slow, but if you do a whole lot, it can start to take time to render. As a nice rule of thumb, a Pixar movie, I've heard that a single image, once they've done everything they need to do with it, can take an entire day to render. They have full suites dedicated to rendering these really high powerful images. This is why video games that are AAA budget titles take so long to make. They have to figure out a way to basically build all these objects, show them in 3 dimensions, and then show them with enough regularity that it functions in a decent way. And so a lot of time and dedication is spent into making that final image and finding a way to not just make that final image, but get that final image to you. RenderView helps with that a lot. Now, if you want to work with Mental Ray and you downloaded Mental Ray from here, this is just serves as a reminder. We have something called Windows, Settings and Preferences, Plugin Manager. What you need to do with that is scroll down to the very bottom. This is after you've installed it, and it'll show up in this little section here: Applications, Autodesk, Mental Ray for Maya 2016 plugins. There's a plugin manager that basically just looks for additions that you can add to Maya to make it run better, make it do new things. There's 100,000 settings. There's a lot of different things that you can do with it to make everything run just as it needs to. Um, for this, I have it set to loaded and auto load. So it loads Maya every time I open it, and it'll load it when the program begins. Click those two boxes, please. They're at the bottom of whatever you currently have. They'll be here somewhere. If you have all your windows open like this, it'll probably show up right before you get to the bottom, maybe a little bit in the middle, somewhere down here if you look at where the scroll wheel is. Um, it'll just be very useful for you to have. Once you have it, you can play around with all these different types of renders. You can play around with making different colored objects and different colored shaders. You can experiment with different lights and the way that they function to build things for you. Now, what I like to do is build kind of a 3-point lighting setup to work um, in the beginning of this. Uh, we will talk about that very soon. We'll talk about how you can build like simple scenes, and I'll show you a couple examples of scenes that are built. But the very last thing that I want to refer to um, in this, besides the different render modes and things that we have, one very important thing to consider is, what if you're making a small preview? How can you start making previews of images that look pretty good? Well, if I go to this little button here, the card with the little circle on it. I'm sorry, not circle, but a gear. These are your render settings. We're going to be using this to actually make what our final images look like. If we scroll down, there will be a bunch of settings in here for not just the render settings, but also the size of the image. We can set a bunch of different types of image resolutions, how they look. 960 by 540 is what I've been working with right now because it's kind of simple and it's easy for me to render something quickly for you to see in this example. But we can also adjust the quality of the images that we have. We'll talk about like what these different things mean, sampling, as well as like everything down here. But you're also, if you go down to scene, you can create physical sun and sky. If I click that, what it'll do is that it'll make basically a test light that will function as not only light but also shadow. It creates a sun. It functions as a directional light, but it's a directional light that has custom made settings for it so that if you render this scene, it basically builds a general light as well as like some like a kind of general sky for yourself as well. It's really useful if you're modeling something and you just need a test look for something, or you're trying to use it as a model for something that you're drawing or something like that. It's really useful. I suggest you play with it, have fun with it, see how it works. There are settings in here under like sun shape where you can change like the color as well as how it functions. You can change the direction of the sun as well as the actual color of the light. Like you can make it more of a sunset, or you can make it more of a like kind of twilight or something like that. There's a bunch of settings to work with. All right, this video has been 40 minutes long. It is extensive, and I am only scratching the surface of what these lights are, what they can do, and how they function. Um, I made this video for you this week because this serves as fundamentals for the core of how these lights can work together. If you feel like you've watched this video and you have a good handle on everything, what I suggest you should do is start by grabbing a few lights and trying to build a small scene. Build an object and see if you can light it. Once you light it, open up your render view, select mental ray from the top view, or if you want to work with something a little bit simpler, even work with Maya software and see if you can just build a scene that has some decent lighting to it. If you can, you're on your way. If you have any questions, please, as always, let me know.